Welcome to this Asia Global podcast, brought to you by the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. I am your host, Alejandro Reyes, the Institute's Director of Knowledge Dissemination. In our programs here in Hong Kong and online, and in the content that we produce, we focus on presenting Asian perspectives on global issues. This podcast is part of our Meet the Authors series, where we have a conversation with contributors to AsiaGlobal Online and other publications of the Institute. Joining me now from Singapore are two colleagues from the Singapore University of Technology and Design, Associate Professor Roland Bouffanais and Professor of Communication and Technology Sun Lim, who is Dean of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences at SUTD. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Very nice to see you. Yeah.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, great. Now, Roland and Sun, you co-authored an article in the journal Nature in July about cities and the need to predict super spreading hotspots for COVID-19. And you very kindly adapted this piece for AsiaGlobal Online, and I commend our viewers and readers to read this piece because I think it's very interesting. In your article, you argue that much as combating the coronavirus is a global priority and will continue to be so for some time, lockdowns, as we know them, are a bitter pill to swallow given their harsh side effects. Now, the economic side effects, the closure of businesses, the travel restrictions, even the bankruptcies, the disruption of supply chains. And then there are, of course, social side effects, the physical and indeed mental toll that isolation can take on people and families and households. So you argue that lockdowns, circuit breakers, to use the Singapore terminology, need not be the only solution. And a more calibrated containment strategy can and should be developed using insights gleaned from big data and tools of technology that we have available today. So Roland, if I could start with you, can you tell us more about Sun's and your argument there, and what got you to thinking about this particular issue, which I think is really quite interesting in light of the fact that we're seeing resurgences of the virus and potential return to lockdowns. And we've seen it, returns to lockdowns.
All right, thank you very much, Al, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Indeed, I mean, I think it's still a very pressing topic for all of us. As you mentioned, when we wrote the article, Sun and I wrote that article back in the beginning of the pandemic. For instance, it was around April, and the whole world was in this massive lockdown situation. On all continents, in different shapes and different forms, and early on, people felt like really trapped, and the governments effectively had no other solution. And it seemed to work, and it did work. But now we are right in this situation where numbers, cases are going up again. People suffered a lot during these blanket lockdowns. I think all of us read in the newspapers interesting examples where surfers were complaining about not being able to surf, for instance, and arguing, how am I going to infect anyone if I am on my surfboard? And there were lots of examples. We had some in Singapore. I'm sure you had some in Hong Kong. All countries had, examples showing how silly some of these measures were. And we do not blame the governments because they had to do something. They had to, as the government used in Singapore, stop the circuit, right? Use a circuit breaker to effectively stop that, exponential propagation that was going on. So it worked, but what do we do now? Everybody knows that we are in this for a long time. And we know that we will have to adapt those measures. So going again for a full-scale lockdown is not an option. If you turn to France, if you turn to Germany and Spain and Italy, cases are up and they do not want to go back to where they were in March. So what do we do? What are the solutions? And then you take into account, the fact that people are tired of this. There is this virus fatigue that is seeping in, and then you have also the economies around the world that are doing badly. It has cost a fortune to many countries to pay for that. Some are increasing their debts, like in Europe. Other countries like Singapore have been tapping into their reserves, but we are talking about billions of dollars, billions of euros. So we need something different. And interestingly, a lot of attention has been paid to finding a vaccine, which is something that we have to do. But in our paper, in our article in Nature, what we argue is that there are other ways using big data by looking at effectively laser targeted measures, trying to identify beforehand places that are potentially more susceptible. Now we start as a matter of fact, we have evidence from all big cities around the world of places that are dangerous right now, right? So nightclubs, bars, I think there is consensus that these are super spreaders. It's not just about the people, it's about the people and how people interact socially, where they're coming from, this diversity of people coming together in specific places. So are there other places? Right now in North America and in Europe, schools are reopening. And there is tremendous worry, which I find interesting because for us in Singapore, schools have reopened long ago and everything is going well. So there are ways to do things to identify those super spreader locations. And the main argument of our article in Nature and in your journal in AsiaGlobal Online is that using a combination of human movement network, right, analysis of how people move, where people are coming from, and combined with models in epidemiology, we would be able to spot some of these places that if you want to go for a lockdown, these are the places you should effectively close down early on. Yes. And I know that in Hong Kong, the government has taken some very targeted measures. Never went right for a full-scale lockdown. But can we do better? And can we do that on the basis of data and evidence and scientific analysis? Not just right now, I would say it's more about guessing what places are the most susceptible.
Now it's interesting because in Hong Kong, of course, we had sort of social distancing measures and restrictions, and then I think the situation got better. And then when we had a spike, we actually had more stringent measures. So it created even more of that kind of virus fatigue, that kind of, I mean, as you rightly say, we never had a full lockdown. But it's interesting that in our narrative, we got these stronger measures that then have lasted much longer than the initial period. So, Sun, I'm wondering if you had any thoughts further on the thrust of your article and on the situation indeed from your experience in Singapore. And have you seen this much more nuanced approach adopted anywhere? I mean, in any smart way in Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, or places like that?
Well, simply when we think about the overall battle with the pandemic, and I think when you look at a lot of the commentaries about the pandemic, there's very often the war metaphor used, right? And you can imagine why, because it's going to be so long drawn, it's going to be so protracted. And in this case, where the metaphor breakdown is that the enemy in this case is invisible. So yet at the same time, there seem to be particular kinds of insights that we have already developed that we can distill in order to achieve a more calibrated approach to containing the virus. So in our case, in our article, we wanted very much to draw attention to those places which had taken more calibrated strategies. And that would include places like Hong Kong, places like Singapore and Taiwan and so on, where you don't necessarily go for the full lockdown, but you introduce particular kinds of precautionary measures for communities that are highly susceptible, or you have decongestion protocols for places where there's likely to be a huge scrum of crowds at particular times. And essentially, even as the enemy is invisible, our digital trails are also invisible, right? And yet we can mine all of these digital trails in order to understand patterns in human movements. And we can use this to really think about, what are the kinds of ways in which we can divert traffic or modulate crowds and so on, so that we can prevent super spreader incidents from occurring. And that really was the overriding message that we were trying to send to people.
Yeah. Now, can I ask you both, maybe play devil's advocate here, because so say, once post COVID-19, we're maybe 2-3 years from now, we then hear news of another virus that's possibly breaking out wherever. Now, we don't know about the infection rate or the nature of this virus or how infectious it is or how it's even spread. But given the experience that we've had, wouldn't it make sense to say, lockdown, do the maximum first, then you get more information about the nature of this new threat, and then you can be more strategic? Or is it possible to be strategic from the beginning with an unknown adversary?
Son, if I may, just
please.
I think we actually experienced that scenario with COVID-19.
Right.
We experienced SARS in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Vietnam as well, and all these countries reacted pretty well early on, and many other countries in Europe and North America discarded that as being very far away. Maybe Canada was different because they were quite affected by SARS in 2003. But I was in Singapore at that time, so that's my second pandemic in Singapore. I think there was readiness at some level, and the lockdown response was actually based on that. And the countries that as I just said, that experienced that, they knew what they were up to, and that's also true in Africa. If you read about some countries that experienced Ebola, for instance, these countries had a response in place. So. There is no doubt about what you said, is that in the future, this global experience that we are living will definitely push some countries to review their readiness level and their how prepared they are. Now the question is, when will this happen? And what we have seen in the past is that governments and people tend to forget very quickly, and they see that as when everything goes well. Do we really need to allocate budget for preparedness and so on? That was an example that has been given in the US, where effectively the federal government agency in charge of monitoring outbreaks has been cut recently.
Yes.
Simply, yeah. So I personally believe that humanity will learn from that experience. The problem still is that, there is virus and virus.
Yes.
COVID, SARS-CoV-2 is quite different from Ebola, which is different from MERS. And as you mentioned, there is these epidemiological factors that we need to understand as well.
And I think perhaps the difference, the big difference between SARS in 2003 and today was we have so many more sophisticated technological tools that help us with this more strategic approach, right, Sun? I think that you would certainly agree in terms of that, and that maybe we should be thinking more how we harness these tools.
Yes, absolutely. So you could say that the COVID-19 is the first pandemic to emerge in a highly digitalizing world.
Yeah.
And so we have, all kinds of data trails from not just our smartphones, but also Internet of Things connected devices. And all of these actually build a very dense, informative, and dynamic network of information that can help to inform how we plan and how we look at the movement of people, and by extension, the movement of youth too.
So let me just ask a last question about this, the pandemic and your article. What are the privacy concerns as you see them? Because now, particularly with contact tracing, if you're tracking people and you're tracking people's movements and trying to understand where potential hotspots might be, I mean, I'm recalling the recent incident of a super spreader in Korea whose whereabouts, which were made public, were somewhat revealing about that person. Is this something that we simply have to be resigned to in the interests of public health? And then of course I would say, well, there will always be people, if you look at even the resistance in the United States to wearing masks and all that, there will be people who will be concerned about infringements on liberty and freedom, infringements on freedom. What are your thoughts on this sort of privacy concerns?
So I actually find it quite fascinating because one would have thought that in a world where, you know, we're willing to sign off on all kinds of agreements without having actually read through them, and where we've gotten used to the trend of getting conveniences in exchange for giving up part of our information and part of our privacy, that people would actually seize upon contact tracing, and that people would be quite amenable to submitting themselves and their movement data to other agencies. And yet, if you look at the situation in Singapore or in other countries that have attempted to introduce contact tracing apps, you will find that the take-up rate is actually quite modest. So it does suggest to us that despite this sort of transactional approach that people have towards data and towards sharing data in the interest of conveniences, that sort of linkage between your personal privacy and perhaps your health seems to be quite visceral, and that sort of holds people back from giving up all of their data. Yeah. So it's definitely still an unfolding situation. It may well be that, you know, as the pandemic wears on, and if people are convinced that if they trade up a bit more of privacy, that they could have a little bit more liberty of movement, that they could be convinced to, you know, sign on for these kinds of contact tracing measures. But one shall, you know, just track the situation and see how it unfolds. But clearly, the whole concept of privacy and individual perceptions around privacy are not cast in stone and continue to evolve. And the pandemic situation has introduced a very interesting curveball into this whole online privacy debate.
Roland, what are your thoughts, especially, you know, coming from Europe? I mean, in Europe, there's, you know, there's in many ways a more progressive attitude towards the issue of privacy and the data in the digital age. What are your thoughts, particularly, you know, you live in Singapore, where, yeah, of course, these concerns are, and even in Hong Kong now, in the current situation here in Hong Kong, people have concerns about using, I mean, we don't actually have the kind of apps that have been used in Singapore and Taiwan, but people would, I think many people assume it would be controversial to introduce them here.
It's an interesting question, because you're right to say that across the globe, you have very different approaches. Now, from what I know from Europe, because I've been effectively stuck in Singapore, you know, since the beginning of the pandemic. So all I know is from friends, family, and the news, is that, yeah, they have developed apps, but you know, Europeans are not as high tech as what you have in Asia. So in a sense, the take-up rate is extremely low, even lower than that. So effectively, those apps are, you know, there is nothing you can do about it, because the data is just too coarse. You just don't have enough to be effective in doing any kind of tracing, which is a pity. In other places, like in Singapore, it's almost mandatory to enter any shopping center, any office building. You need to effectively give your data. So even if you do not have the app that is tracing each and every single step that you're taking, there is quite a decent amount of data that is being collected. And I think people are okay with that, because they want to move on with their lives. So there is these psychological factors to privacy issues. And I think Sun mentioned that before that, people are, you know, we're all happily using all these apps and trading, you know, free service for privacy and without any concern. And our phone providers can track us, you know, up to the meter. It's scary when you look into those privacy issues. You realize, you know, how much data there is, and people do not fret about this. They accept it, right? And when the government comes, some governments come and say we should do this, then there is a huge pushback. That is always a tension, you know, because it's coming from the government, and people have to effectively react. Somehow it gives the impression that they trust more big tech companies than governments, which is very surprising given the lack of regulations you have in this area. But I'd like to mention something is that, that's a point we're making in our article, is you do not need to give your, I don't know, ID or passport number or, all these details to provide useful data to identify super spreaders. Anonymized data is sufficient. If that data was somehow treated by an agency that is above governments, that ensures that privacy concerns are dealt with, we could have that data about human movements without knowing who is that person. That would be very useful in a sense in identifying how people interact, what kind of patterns of interaction you have, that will tell us that a bar is more prone to super spreading events than say a concert. I don't have the data right now, but these studies have been done before by scientists. That's the point we're making. People have studied human interactions in kindergartens, in nursing homes, and of course they're vastly different. Depending on the group of universities, also extremely interesting. You hear the number of cases in the US. You have a population at risk. You have these students, and they want to study and they want to party at the same time, and that conflicts with the issues of we're dealing with right now. So again, privacy has to be taken into account if we want to gather data. But for what we're proposing is that we could effectively deal with those privacy concerns, just having raw data. And that's something we mentioned, is that in places like Paris or Singapore, you have actually travelers data. In Hong Kong, you use the octopus card widely. We do not need to know who owns that card, but just by knowing that, how people go from place to place, how they interact, this information is tremendously useful for those purposes.
I guess though that, yes, I use my octopus card, but it is possible if someone really wanted to link that octopus card to me, because there's a number, and indeed, if you go back to the protests last year, many of the protesters refused to use their octopus cards because they felt that it would allow government to track them. But I mean, it does get into sort of murky waters, and I guess, as you might say, I mean, it depends in terms of the confidence that people have, whether they get, I guess, paranoid, or how they react, and they're different in different places. People react in different ways, which brings me, in fact, to this. I'm really fascinated by how both of you work in what I would call a kind of magical area of academics. It's this nexus of design, technology, science, and humanity and society. It seems to me to be, a truly rich, very rich landscape for the researcher, an area that, laymen like myself, I would find really enthralling, because if you're just thinking about how our lives have been changed by technology in just a few years. I was thinking about, most people got on the internet about 1995, say, and that's just 25 years ago. So I'm wondering, Roland, if you could tell us a bit about your work. You did your studies in Switzerland, postdoctoral research at MIT. And I know in your work that this concept of applied complexity is something that you're working on. I wonder if you'd tell us a bit about that, because I think applied complexity sounds like an oxymoron, but clearly there's some deep thinking in there.
Absolutely. I mean, I thought about this, and the field of complexity, maybe I should give a definition. Complexity refers to processes where you have multiple interactions and you have an emergent behavior. And I like to give classical example is how you have plenty of fish schooling together. They don't know exactly what they're doing. Some very simple behavior. They all have the same behavior, and you have this emergent collective behavior, which is this schooling behavior. And most of the time, this is the purpose of protecting the school from an attack from predators. So all these awe-inspiring behaviors, flock of birds, that you have in insect colonies, and so on. These are emergent behaviors and they're treated by complexity. Complexity refers to the analysis of systems in general, where you have many agents, many parts that can be humans, they can be animals, they can be robots. And through their interactions, they perform something that is greater than the sum of the parts. That's what complexity refers to. And obviously, as soon as your agent is a human agent, you step into the social sciences. You have, social elements. You have psychological elements to take into account. And sometimes, interestingly, if you look at humans in case of emergency, well, we very much behave like an animal. There are a lot of studies have been made on, problem of fire safety and how humans behave in case of emergency. You study that, it's very much like an emergent behavior, very much like animals. And we tend to think that we are very sophisticated. Some people would not even use the term animal. And that is true in one sense. Yeah, it's true that, we take into account a lot of factors, but deep down, when you look at a city and you look at how people move and you look at fads, how they propagate, all of this is based on social networks, how people interact online, how people interact physically speaking in the cities. And there is nothing more fascinating than the city itself, which is, truly complex. Again, people in complexity science have studied how cities are growing, how they are growing in the third dimension in Asia, for instance, how traffic emerges, traffic jam, it's complexity. You have many people sharing the road and suddenly you have traffic jam and the jam disappears. So the work in my group is we try to understand complexity, some forms of complexity, and we try to make good use of it to solve problems. For instance, can we understand human networks, human flow networks, how people interact in various locations based on data, based on network science. And I think people are familiar with social networks, but they don't realize and they don't appreciate that there is a lot we could do to serve them, not just to exchange, pictures of cats or movies of cats on social networks.
I almost think about the Jeff Goldblum character in Jurassic Park, that scientist about chaos, and I'm thinking that those are you guys almost, right?
Well, this is how Hollywood depicts, scientists. And
yes.
The reality, I can tell you, the reality is very different.
Right.
You have, I'm sure at the University of Hong Kong, you also have some very interesting characters in science. That is true. But that's, Jeff Goldblum was I like to watch that movie just to see how not real that is.
Yes. Right. Now, Sun, you recently co-edited the Oxford Handbook of Mobile Communications and Society. And then if you go into this area about trying to understand complexity, of course, now, everybody's got a device. And even if you go in the developing world, people have their devices. And even my my non-techie brother, who still carries a flip phone, he's got a device, although he hasn't yet ventured into having a smartphone. What are we going to see then in the future with mobile communications? Is it about more wearables, more monitors, more IoT sensors all over the place? What should we know about mobile communications going forward?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and obviously when we wrote the book, or when we put together the book, we realized the overwhelming influence that mobile communication was having on all realms of life, which is why we have sections covering everything from banking to healthcare to social interaction to gaming and so on. And the real question, I think, as you have identified through your brother's relationship with his phone, is that it's a kind of domestication process that each of us as individuals undergo when we use these devices and we incorporate them into our lifestyles and so on. And then collectively in society, how do we adopt these technologies, and then how do we also introduce regulatory structures to control their effects or to manage their effects, right? So I think the whole problem of online falsehoods has been one of the big sort of negative fallout of the proliferation of mobile communication, because precisely because we are inundated with all this information and we've got this ability to share, so we've been sharing sort of indiscriminately and so on, and that leads to a kind of downward spiral in our society in terms of the spread of misinformation. So ultimately, I think, you know, we need to look beyond just the devices per se, but also to think about the sort of undergirding digital infrastructures that determine how these devices are and their information is being used. And in that particular regard, you know, it goes back to our question on privacy, right? Which is when each of us is sharing all of this data that is tracking our dynamic movements, how much of this data will be used in ways that are to our benefit, how much of them will be used against us, and do the algorithms that are used to decode and analyze all of these data, are they fair, are they equitable, or will we end up using and misusing this information against the interests of society? So one really good example is, for example, the health data, right, that you and I might be tracking on our phones. Will insurance companies be able to use that to punish us for, you know, being more sedentary? Will employers actually find that they are less likely to promote employees who take less healthy behaviors? So these are the kinds of ways in which information that are being tracked about us through whether it's wearable technology or whether it's mobile devices, these are the ways in which we have to be cautious about how the increasing encroachment of technology can change our ways of life and also our models of governance.
It's interesting because, you know, I've thought about, you know, the adoption of mobile technology. I refer to my brother, how that's affected family interaction, you know, indeed. And the fact that I have one brother of my three who is not on a smartphone, he is more difficult to bring into the fold, into the conversation whenever we want to have a kind of family discussion. And it's interesting because therein lies an issue of technology adoption and how it affects family dynamics. And I just find it really I find this fascinating. And what it seems to me an area that's amazing in terms of research. Now, is there any particular area that you're now working on in your research, Sun?
Yes, I'm working on the digital disruptions in the workplace because, you know, so much of our workplaces and our industries are digitalizing and automating. We have to think about the kinds of anxieties that workers have towards entering this new workplace where they may not feel that they have competencies that are equal to the transformation. And what are the ways in which companies can manage workers' anxieties as well as provide them with the support. And collectively, governments also need to think about upskilling their employees, their citizens, so that they don't feel that they are displaced. So this is actually quite an urgent issue, but we wanted to use an ethnographic approach to shed light on the ground realities and the pain points that people in these situations actually experience.
Fascinating. Now, Roland, I'm wondering if I could broaden the scope even more to talk about, you know, you're coming from having done your studies in Europe and Switzerland, and then you did your postdoctoral work at MIT. You've been in Singapore for a while, but you know, what are your thoughts in terms of you know, what brought you to Singapore? What attracted you there, and how do you see the difference of the sort of academic life in Singapore from what you experienced in Europe and the United States?
Interesting question. I maybe just to give a bit more perspective, before I did my PhD in Switzerland, I actually lived in Singapore, and I got a taste of the fast-paced life that we experience in Hong Kong and Singapore and Bangkok and other places, and this very fast adoption of technology. Yes. You mentioned your brother, but you know, I can tell you that, you know, back in Europe, people are even slower than that. So there is this big difference, and there is no doubt that, you know, when some big tech companies want to try something, very often they turn to Hong Kong and Singapore as a test bed because people are prompt. So there is something special in East Asia in general, I would say. And of course, Singapore is a fantastic place that offers a lot of opportunity for a scientist. I think I see Singapore as being maybe what the US was 30 years ago. That place where, European academics will flock, searching for, opportunities that you would not find home. So I had the chance to do, as you said, do my PhD in a wonderful institution in Switzerland at EPFL. It's one of Switzerland is a great small place in Europe. It's a haven for scientists. MIT was, of course, truly an amazing place. But I found that Singapore had a lot to offer for junior academics, in a sense. And as I mentioned, you have amazing students that are, knocking at your door maybe too often. All right, they're too hardworking.
Right.
And a lot of potential. I have 5 PhD students from all over Asia, some even from Denmark, and bringing all these people together in Singapore is a great experience. And I think it's not the only place in the world, but Singapore has a lot to offer to an academics.
Now, Sun, one of the things that people might not know is that you served as a nominated member of parliament, an NMP, is to use the Singapore acronym. Now, in the Singapore context, being an NMP is, I think, you have an awesome responsibility in the Singapore context, the political context there. You served for 2 years, 2018 to just recently. What did you learn from those 2 years of service, of being in the political arena, as it were?
So it's an interesting scheme where you invite people from particular sectors that may not have sufficient representation in Parliament, yes, to step up and to voice the opinions of these different sectors. So it's everything from healthcare to disability to sport, culture, and of course academia, which I represented. And I saw it as a very interesting opportunity, a bigger classroom, if you will, to share insights from academia. So I took that responsibility quite seriously in terms of, for example, whenever there was a particular bill or a particular issue where academic insights could provide quite some illumination, that I would then do the due diligence of consulting colleagues whose research was in that particular area, and then I would share it in the House. And I would say that it was very valuable in the sense that, I was able to show that academic research has a great deal to offer in terms of enhancing our understanding of particular kinds of issues. But separately for myself, I also realized that, Parliament and the kinds of pathways it opened for me in terms of talking to policymakers, in terms of talking to political office holders. It also gave me an opportunity to articulate particular kinds of positions that we think should be given more airing in the public space. So it's very much, I think, a synergistic relationship, and it's an opportunity that I very much appreciated, and sort of a taste of politics life.
Roland, do you think that some European countries could adopt this kind of system to get these kinds of voices into their legislatures?
That's a very interesting scheme, I agree, but European politics is quite diverse from one country to another. I think they still, the parliaments and the governments in general, they still closely work with people in academia, in different walks of life. So it's also like, do you have these open channels, yeah, in terms of, for instance, do you have a security council that will look at the experts in, cyber attacks or things like that? I am not sure if they really need to have somebody sitting in parliament. Singapore is also like, different. It's a city-state, it's small, and I think it's indeed important that the government listens to these people that are not into politics. And I think the beauty of that scheme is that, people are not there because they are trying to get a seat. They are not trying to get elected. They are not here to make promises and say things that people want to hear. So in that respect, this is something interesting and very useful in a sense. Yeah.
Now, thanks very much. I know you both have been very generous with your time. I just wanted to close the way I've been closing most of these conversations, is to ask about the pandemic and how things are for you in terms of coping with the pandemic. I know the school year is just opening and you're interacting with students, and how is that going? How do you find your students kind of themselves coping? Roland, if I could, you know, what's your experience at this point?
Well, I mean, it's obviously there are aspects that are difficult, in particular for us in Singapore, because we cannot leave the country. So this is where you realize how small Singapore is indeed, when you lose the ability to travel to say Hong Kong and so on, and what we used to do, it was so connected. But on the daily basis, it's surprising to see that, you know, it's almost like business as usual, I would dare to say. Yeah, people are wearing masks. It's like almost like second nature. Like, you know, I have my kids' friends coming at home, and I have to tell them, you can take off your mask. You know, they keep it on. Like, they're so used to it. It's actually the 6-year-old. You know, they are. So when I hear all these debates around the world about being worried about kids reopening, schools reopening, and worrying, I find this surprising. So in a sense, you know, at least the current situation in Singapore, and that, you know, touch wood, you know, stays the way it is. There are ways to control things. There are ways to get things under control. We all have to do our part in giving some of the things we like. You know, I can't travel. I can't see my family. I feel very disconnected. I haven't seen my mother in you know, for almost a year, more than a year now. So that's a price we have to pay. It's a steep price. But then, you know, there is the safety of everybody, of our community. So I think we know we are in this for quite a long time. Bill Gates said, you know, 2021, maybe 2022. So we have to adopt that mindset that we are in this for another year minimum, right? And the best way to cope with that is to look at the bright side, look at the things that are working, and carry on. You know, my kids went back to school last week. They're very happy at school. Of course, you know, they complain about the mask, they complain about this, but they are with their friends. I think it's so much better than, you know, trying to keep them at home and protect them from you don't know what, right? Yes. So that's my perspective, and it's a very personal perspective, I have to say. I know that some people cope better, and you know, there are ups and downs. You know, I feel fairly positive right now, but there are moments where, you know, I really feel I could be with, you know, with my family back in France, and but that's the way it is.
Sun, what are your thoughts? What's your perspective? So I think the first few months with the lockdown was quite surreal. Were quite surreal, but as Roland says, our lives actually have gotten back to normal. And in SUTD, because we are a boutique university, our student numbers are manageable. So I will actually be returning to the classroom next week, teaching with my students of classes of 25 and below, and I will have to wear my face mask, possibly my face shield, but you know, it still beats seeing my students via Zoom. And for the larger classes, we're going to do that online. And I think even with online classes, we've been able to see some of their virtues. You know, students appreciate the ability to rewind certain, replay certain sections of the lectures that they might not understand. They also find that those who are a little bit more reticent are more comfortable asking questions online than they would be face-to-face. So I guess, you know, pluses and minuses with the different modalities, but I think I do feel the buzz returning to campus, so that's very encouraging.
Great. Now, thank you both. You've been very generous with your time. It's been very interesting to talk to you, and I commend our readers and our viewers to read Roland and Sun's article in Nature and also on AsiaGlobal Online. Please follow us on social media. And again, thank you, Sun. Thank you, Roland. It's been lovely to connect with you. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Al.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.